Hello, and welcome now as we come to the fourth Sunday or fourth weekend of the Easter time. And just to begin, the readings for the day, again, first reading comes from the book of Acts, still chapter 2, this time verses 14a and then verses 36 through 41. The second reading comes from the letter of Peter, chapter 2, verses 20b to 25. And the Gospel of John from chapter 10, verses 1 through 10. Now, a word about the gospel tradition. From now until the end of the Easter season and even into the Extra seasons, in which we will be celebrating Trinity and Corpus Christi, all of the Gospels will be coming from that of John. So I thought that as we begin, I might do just a little background about the fourth Gospel, and we will find that some of the selections for our consideration over the coming weeks will be continuations of one another, and so that will require a little connection taking place. As we have mentioned a number of times, but as I look back over the last almost 3 years now of our kind of gathering together, and I thought of this too, that those of you who may be watching sometimes on and off, if you have any questions about some of the scripture readings that are assigned for the various weekends, and that for whatever reasons, maybe we give some answers here or even raise some questions, if you would like me to address some particular questions, please do send them either to our Facebook or to our rectory here, and I will be glad to answer them as best I can. So all of that is a little preface to the fourth gospel, which you remember, probably as best we can put it together, was written sometime between the year 90, that would be the last decade of the first century, and some authors even suggest it may have been into the early second century, although most likely the argument for the 90s is the better. As we have mentioned, considering that the year 90 and the time of Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension would be roughly around the year 30, there is a 60-year difference between the actual time of Jesus and the writing of this gospel. That's important to notice, that perhaps already we might be looking at a second generation of Christians when it comes to the Gospel of John. But nevertheless, it's important to keep that distance of time. The fourth gospel, as we have mentioned a number of times, has a very different chronology from that of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The chronology of John pictures Jesus as moving back and forth from the time that he lives in the Galilee to the time that he is in Judea and in Jerusalem. And in fact, is pictured, I think we have mentioned this, but once again, pictured Jesus as going to the annual feast of the Passover of the Jews 3 times and in his gospel, and that has led to the conclusion from those who follow the chronology of John that Jesus' public ministry took place over a period of 3 years. And I think there is a popular Christian thought that that's how long Jesus' public ministry lasted. It is unlike that of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, who are not quite as quick to say what the time frame of Jesus' public ministry was. All right, so that's a little background. about the fourth gospel's origin. It is generally believed that the work itself is divided into two parts, namely what are known as the Book of Signs and the Book of Glory, and also has a very important prologue. That prologue, which is generally used at the time of the Christmas celebration, is one of the most beautiful and important of those found in the gospel tradition. But the Book of Signs, and this is what I want to mention now, because the reading that we are going to hear this time from chapter 10 is included in the Book of Signs. Now, why is it called the Book of Signs? Because this gospel writer chooses 7, well, now the other traditions call them miracles or actions of power. John's gospel calls them signs. And he works them as a way of pointing out what is essentially the teaching of this gospel, that Jesus is the Son of God. Now, the argument there is that throughout this gospel, that information, that way of thinking is prevalent in how the story of Jesus is told. So, just in review, what are these 7 signs that Jesus performs? Well, here they are in their order. The turning of water into wine at Cana of Galilee, the healing of the centurion official who lives in Capernaum, heals his son, the healing of a paralytic by the pool of Bethsaida, Jesus feeding of 5,000, Jesus walking on the water, Jesus healing a man born blind, and Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. So those are the 7 signs, and of course 7 does fit the symbolic pattern that is so very important. As also, in understanding these signs of Jesus, it's important to keep in mind that the author is definitely coming out of the Hebrew tradition. We have mentioned this before, most likely his community might be called Christian Jews, and that the gospel itself is most likely intended to fellow Jews who have accepted Jesus to encourage them. Now, in this gospel, and we'll hear it even a little bit alluded to in the reading today. Now, why do I mention all of this? Because the information in the gospel in verse 10 that we're looking at follows that of the curing of the blind man. So you see, we have to jump around a little bit as the choice of readings are made to put them into perspective with regard to the Johannine gospel. And in this gospel, definitely much of the message against those who stand as opposed to Jesus as the Messiah are the Pharisees. We've mentioned a number of times that in this gospel, very often the Pharisees do not come off looking well or are considered to be the opponents of Jesus. This, again, is not necessarily the case in the other 3 Gospels, but it certainly is here. So, what is the little section that in chapter 10 that we hear today? It can be divided into 2 parts. There are only 10 verses, so we'll divide them kind of equally here. The first part is a parable. Now, this is the only time in the Johannine tradition that a parable is included. The other gospel writers like parables, but in this gospel they do not. So that's what makes this, first of all, interesting. It is the parable of sheep, okay, and that is the image here that is developed this particular Sunday fourth Sunday in Easter, often called Good Shepherd Sunday, because the readings always picture Jesus as a shepherd. Now, keep in mind, sheep, of course, which are the bailiwick of shepherds, were important animals because they, of course, provided food for people in Israel, as well as sheep, the wool and that came from them. So that's what made sheep important. Shepherds, now we give them a very honorable title, and of course Jesus called the Good Shepherd, and that's partially what this little section of the parable is going to argue, that in fact an honorable shepherd is an oxymoron, because an oxymoron, remember, is a contradiction in terms. Shepherds were not generally considered to be good, okay? They were generally viewed as thieves, as men who were often exposing women to shame, who left their family at home to go out into wherever they needed to take care of the sheep during the season, and sometimes were accused of not even protecting their home while they were gone. So when we think of shepherding, and of course we tend to look at, the shepherds at the Christmas time and all of those kind of shepherds. But in fact, and we have alluded to this before, that often shepherds were, it was a job that you kind of needed to do. Often the shepherds did not own the sheep. The sheep were owned by someone else, and so in that way they were hired hands. And you can see that if you're hired to take care of something, or in this case animals, your loyalty lay where? To the sheep, to the owner, or to their own interest. So, in this tradition, when Jesus is presented as an honorable shepherd, we have a kind of different approach. All right, so in this little section that we're listening to this time, Jesus is pictured as being the gate. And in fact, in the story, there is a gatekeeper. Now, the gatekeeper, remember that sheep at night often were put into places where they could be kept. Sometimes sheep of different, when we talk about sheep, and I know we've mentioned all of this, but if this is what is the message of this week, sheep were mixed together because maybe a flock was not quite as big, but the shepherds were to keep the sheep together. So they would often be enclosed in some kind of, maybe a cave, maybe a place where they could not escape, where they could not wander. But there had to be an entrance into the sheepfold, and that therefore was known as the gate. Now, the really loyal shepherd, and there would be few of those, at night, in order to make sure that the sheep kept where they were, would, at the entrance or the gate, lie down across the entrance, so that if one of the sheep was attempting to leave, it had to cross the shepherd. And that could be dangerous if the hoof of one of the shepherds landed on one of the shepherds, say eye or face, that was a kind of risky position to be taking. So, in this, as we will hear, Jesus is pictured as saying that the good shepherd does the various things that I've just mentioned, whereas the others act as thieves, bandits, and strangers. Now, when you kind of aim this at the Pharisees, you can see that this is not going to be taken so well. So who has legitimate access to the sheep? Well, it would be the shepherd who knows his sheep. Now it is also, and we've mentioned this earlier on in other discussions, known that the sheep would recognize the voice of the shepherd. Now it could be a name, it could be a sound that was given instead of a name, but the sheep of the individual shepherd or owner of the sheep would recognize that sound. So hence the understanding we will hear, calls his own sheep by name. Now, this is interesting because Palestinian shepherds frequently gave names to their sheep, and they had favorites, so we are told. For example, one would be called Long Ears, or one might be called White Nose. So they even, like you give pets names, gave to the sheep names. So all of this is a little lore about sheep and shepherding. But the honorable now, the gatekeeper appears to be one who exactly does that, keeps the gate open or shut. Now, is this to let the sheep come out, or is this to keep those who had other intentions from coming in? So, the honorable shepherd, and here would be the characteristics that fit him, would enter by the door instead of sneaking in some other way. So who would sneak in other ways? Well, all those who were strangers or were seeking to do harm to the sheep. Who are those? Well, those are the Pharisees. So you can see that there is this kind of antagonism here that's being set up. The true gatekeeper, of course, recognizes as genuine sheep his, and he allows them to enter, and he also might allow them to exit, depending. He leads the sheep out, again, is what the gatekeeper does. Now, this would be different because very often the shepherds were pictured as following the sheep. The sheep would go first, and the shepherd would walk behind to keep things in order, to keep them from, kind of wandering. So there was a logicalness to this. But the good shepherd walks in front of the sheep follow him and are loyal, and that, of course, would be the image that is being suggested with regard to Jesus as the good shepherd. So, briefly, you have the parable, which is in the first 5 verses, and then in verses 6 through 10, you have, now some argue here, and this would be a discussion, again, about those who analyze the fourth gospel at this point, that you have what is called an allegory. Namely, he kind of analyzed, remember, allegory suggests that there are hidden meanings to stories. The original parable itself would speak for itself and would end with a kind of question or invitation. So is this allegorical here? Although, again, some interpreters, and there are more interpreters of John's gospel sometimes than you could flick a nickel at, there are many, say, no, this is not allegory at all. It simply has allegorical elements, but it really still remains a parable, while others say, no, it's purely allegorical. All right, so all of that is to say, and one can get the conclusion here nicely, that Jesus is, and it's an image, I am the gate. So we often think of Jesus as the shepherd, a good shepherd, of course, but Jesus as the gate is one of those many what we call I am statements that appear in the fourth gospel. Now keep in mind, as I mentioned at the beginning here, that this follows the sign of the healing of the blind man. Now, we heard this story back in the Lenten time, you remember, where the blind man had been cured. His neighbors had said, "Is this the blind man?" He said, "Yes, I am." The leaders had asked who had done this because it had been done on the Sabbath. He said, "I don't know," and without going through the whole thing, but you remember they had questioned the blind man's parents, "Is this really your son?" "Yes." And all of that had concluded by the words that those who see sometimes don't see, and those who don't see, see. So it had to do with faith, in believing whether or not truly, which is one of the consistent messages throughout this gospel, that Jesus is truly the Son of God. And it's at this point that chapter 10, as we've mentioned before, this aligning of chapters was something which the early church did. And in this sense, with regard to the Gospel of John, sometimes this dividing up into chapters doesn't immediately follow, because this story of the Good Shepherd, or the shepherd who is the gate, follows the blind story, where those who see don't see, refuse to see. What are they? Like thieves, like bandits. Who are we pointing to? Once again, the leadership. Who had been the leadership who had objected to Jesus' healing of the blind man? None other than the Pharisees. So you do see, and we have to be careful, we don't want to develop this overly, but we do see where the connections are made here in this particular episode in the fourth gospel. So it belongs in the book of signs. It follows the sixth of the signs. Remember, we said the last one was Lazarus, which again we looked at and talked about earlier in our discussions this year. So, what, and I don't have a whole lot more to say, I guess, about this particular episode. It does kind of point out, and just in conclusion, a little bit about Jesus as the gate, that there is this double sense, okay? Therefore, the gate is the means of access to the sheep. Well, for those who are nobly inclined, those who have good intentions, those who believe that Jesus is the Son of God, certainly are welcomed into the sheepfold, into the fold of Jesus. But the other meaning is that the sheep can leave the fold. And in some ways, one can also see that as being followers of the shepherd, when the sheep leave the fold, they are encouraged, well, where do the sheep go? They don't wander aimlessly out into the world, but they bring the news and the story of the gospel with them. So, again, the book of signs is the first division of this. The second book, by the way, this is the way they divide the gospel, is the book of glory. This, of course, happens toward the very end of the Johannine gospel. There's not much time left before Jesus is to return to his heavenly home. Now, it's interesting, in this gospel, which sometimes when it comes to developing what we call a theology or Christology about Jesus, that it is called the descending view, because it had begun with the prologue that I mentioned before. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh. So you start from the heights, and you go to earth here. And now, in the book of glory, we are beginning to tell the story of Jesus' return from which he came. Now, is this a descending theology or an ascending? but it becomes one of the predominant ways of looking at Jesus throughout our history. And as you may know, the fourth gospel played a significant role in the councils, the first four ecumenical councils of the church, which met between the years 325 and 451. All of that is a little bit of background, really, this time. Finally, just a word about the second reading, which is attributed to Peter. The advice that the writer gives here is that the hearer, that would be, puts up with suffering. It is one of the major objectives of this particular letter, and it strengthens the reader's spirit in a time of adversity. Now, we're not sure that the persecution that the readers are undergoing was at imperial hands. Perhaps it was done more by local magistrates who harassed their workers. So it's not the suffering so much that is emphasized in this little section, but what we would call patient endurance. That you put up with this kind of difficulty for the sake of Christ. So some think that the whole purpose of this passage may have come from an extant hymn of the first century. So there's a lot goes on, and that's what I'm just kind of suggesting to us as we listen to this. A lot goes on in these writings. This letter attributed to Peter, we mentioned this earlier on, was probably not written by Peter, but by given the name, because names, of course, give strong support to the message that is being shared. Why do we suggest that this may be a little section of a hymn in the section that we hear? Because, and you have to be very subtle here to notice this, there's a switch from the second person to the third person. So we're talking about you, and then you're talking about it. And that would be suggesting that some of the material in this section of the letter comes from an early creed. And finally, this work uses material found in the famous prophet that Christians like in the Old Testament, none other than Isaiah, and from what is known as the servant song of Isaiah. Because if you go to compare it, and this would be Isaiah chapter 53, verses 4 through 7, if you go and compare it, you will notice that the words here and those found in Isaiah are identical. So it does suggest that there already is some kind of interworking that goes on in the early Christian writers with this prophet that we hear so regularly, and as I've mentioned so often, is one of the most popular of prophets in the Old Testament that Christian writers and Christian thinkers like to use. So all of this kind of this time around has been a sort of potpourri of information. We will be, as I mentioned, be listening to the Gospel of John right through until early June. So it gives us a lot of time to reflect a little bit more, perhaps on other sections also of the Scripture as we are looking at it. The Johannine Gospel, again, in the end, is one that emphasizes relationships. The most important relationship that Jesus has is that he is Son of God. That is the most intimate, most personal, and closest of relationships. But also there is an important relationship that Jesus has with the sheep, with his people, with us. And so relationships work that way. And of course, in conclusion, what is the relationship that the sheep should have with one another is that intimate relationship, and we will hear much more about this, which is bonded by love. Love of neighbor, the same love that we have for God. Thank you for being with us. Hope to see you again.